Hundreds? All right.
Hundreds. We got hundreds of audience
We're not that
members.
popular. All right, anyways.
Dang.
Start of the actual thing. Hi, everyone. My name's Sean. I'm a rising freshman. Chill. I'm a rising freshman going to NYU. Go.
Hey, my name is Henry. I'm also a rising freshman going to NYU.
Max, and I'm going into my first year of high school.
All right. Today's topic, as you can probably tell by the title, hopefully, is going to be about model minorities. We're going to probably be going down like a pretty comprehensive way of talking about them. So we're going to talk about like what they mean, how they developed, and also probably how they affect mainly our lives, but also we want to kind of analyze how they affect generally Asian Americans all across the U.S. So yeah, we can start off with what an actual model minority is.
Model minority.
I mean, if you guys want to think, I can give my definition first, if you guys want to think.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think a model minority was a stereotype that started around the mid-1900s, where Asians were viewed as very hardworking, very studious group of people that rarely complained about like either setbacks or inequality. So they were just these like super efficient groups of people that kept their heads down. So not only did they produce a lot, they also didn't complain a lot, and it made it sort of created the perception that this is like what the perfect person should be, what the perfect like immigrant to America should be. That's what a model minority means to me.
Yeah, especially they also didn't complain about money, so they're super cheap as well.
Yeah. Max, you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally the stereotype kind of made the entire group of people pretty one-dimensional, right? Because there wasn't really anything else to it other than the fact that they had these very diligent personalities. That's kind
Diligent.
of diligent.
Okay, so I think it's important to go over like how the model minority started. So in my history class, like we learned a lot about the state of America during the mid-1900s, and specifically around like 1940-ish. That was when World War II started. America's diplomacy was like kind of not looking too well. They were mostly, because of how like racist their central body of like inhabitants were, it was kind of hard to make diplomatic allies. So politicians saw it beneficial to sort of like boost the public perception of Asians so that people would like Asians more, and it would be much easier to like make allies with them. Because if America is seen as accepting of Asians, then well, why wouldn't Asians want to ally with us? And that was like generally the strategy that politicians took. You can see like a sudden uptick in like newspapers, public figures, pretty much like anyone that could be like publicly seen or is on public record. You can see a sudden uptick in how they treated Asian Americans. Like they called them hardworking, they called them studious, they called them diligent. All of it sort of developed a model minority because America was seeking allies. And also, this is sort of unrelated to Asian Americans, but as a double whammy, it allowed for more negative use of African Americans, because if politicians were able to say like, well, look at how studious and hardworking these Asian Americans are, they could also easily just to say, well, why can't African Americans achieve this same level of success if both are minorities anyways? So yeah, that's sort of the history of the model minority.
Yeah, and not just only African Americans, but also any other minority, including like Latinos and such minority groups like that.
Oh, yeah.
I think it established like a hierarchy among ethnicities, and it put Asian Americans at the top. And that's really where the whole model minority thing comes from.
I think it's important to also note here that it's like in that hierarchy of ethnicities, which I definitely agree exists, like whites are not included in this at all. Like they're above the hierarchy in such like a superseding sense that like they are not brought into like which ethnicity is better at all, because like they're always on top, and that's how like dominant the prominent group in America is. Also, I think it's worth noting that like before this sudden uptick in like praising Asian Americans in the mid-1900s, it's worth looking at like how Asian Americans were viewed before all the praise came in. Like in places like Chinatown and from like all across America, because there were like certain industries such as like the gambling or prostitution, like Asians were viewed as like exotic, immoral, very like just like not a good group of people. And they had the same perception as like many other minority groups. It was just like really negative and like not a good like standard to follow for children, I suppose. That's how you would view it. Like these groups just didn't have like any benefits to them, and like it was really easy to demonize them for all of America. So yeah, that's like generally the history. I don't know if I like missed anything if you guys want to talk about it. Now we can sort of talk about, I guess, like how the model minority impacts us. I mean, do you guys like any personal impacts for the model minority that you guys have felt?
I think I personally grew up in a pretty progressive environment, so I didn't really deal with a lot of the stereotypes of model minority, I would say. I think the biggest experience I've had with it is just joking among friends, I guess. I mean, we understand that there is this model minority and this stereotype of how Asian Americans are supposed to be. And there is a little bit of pressure placed on myself, I think, but generally it's been pretty alike compared to how I think it was in the past.
Yeah, I agree with Max. I've had a pretty similar experience with the model minority. However, I do remember many times that I was asked I was assumed that I was good at math. I think that is a very common Asian stereotype, that we're good at math. I don't remember how many times I was asked if I was in honors math, and every single time I was like, I've never been in honors math.
Bro-filled calculus.
So I think that's the most common. That's the most I've experienced the model minority directly. But I'm sure all of us have experienced it indirectly in some ways.
Yeah, I think when it comes to like meaningless I'm not gonna say meaningless, but like when it comes to microaggressions such as those, it's harmful because it ends up like perpetuating the model minority. So like although it kind of seems like benign, like you're just saying, oh, you're good at math. That might even seem like good because you're complimenting them. It's still like based off of an assumption about your race that like ends up perpetuating this perception of like, oh, this Asian here is good at math. He's not going to complain a lot, and he's probably really smart. And that's a really dangerous like sort of perception to perpetuate, because it ends up pushing these Asian Americans out of like any ability to move socially. Like, so I've had similar experiences with model minority where, because of the environment I was raised in, I haven't experienced any effects of it. But I know that like statistically, Asian Americans are much less likely to be elected for manager positions or overseer positions. And this is because of the perception that, and this is because of not only the perception, but the perpetuation of that perception that Asian Americans are very good workers, but not good leaders. Like, you give them a math problem, they can solve it. You give them like a comp sci problem, they can solve it. But if you tell them to lead a team, there's sort of this like underlying assumption that Asian Americans are not good at social work. They're not good at like telling people what to do and getting people to work together. And that comes from perceiving Asian Americans as like, oh, you're good at math and like pretty much nothing else. That's how like these microaggressions can be really dangerous, because it ends up just like setting in stone this sort of like very incorrect belief that like Asian Americans can't progress outside of like just being good workers.
Yeah, and I think these particular traits, because there's so many of these traits that people put onto Asian Americans, it kind of takes away individuality, right? Because with model minority, when people look at Asians, they say, okay, you all have these traits, and you all are good at math, and not good at management positions, etc. And so it kind of fails to recognize the different personalities and skill sets of each Asian individual. And that's kind of what's pretty dangerous, because it takes away from a lot of potential, I would say. A lot of them could be doing a lot more if people saw them for their skills and their abilities rather than the stereotype of what their skills and abilities are.
Well, I think it's not like so much like, I don't think it's so much that these Asian Americans could be doing more. It's just that these Asian Americans could be doing more of what they want specifically. I think it's like dangerous to say that the Asian American race could be more productive. Like, no, that's not the perception we want to give. It's that the Asian American race can be happier and like they can do more for themselves, not like help the overall system of the United States more.
strive towards their own individual goals.
Which I think is illegitimate. Anyways.
Yeah, and not only is this dangerous for from the economic or financial standpoint of a manager role or just the workforce in general, but for kids, it's extremely stressful to not adhere to the model minority. As an Asian American, if you aren't good at math, just the stereotype of all Asians are good at math puts an unnecessary amount of pressure on you being good at math, and this not only like puts a lot of pressure on you, it puts a lot of pressure on your parents or vice versa, for you succeeding in school.
Yeah.
And,
Sorry.
I think that leads to a lot of like mental health issues, which is a completely other conversation.
Yeah, so like going back to the point of individuality that Max brought up earlier, the main sort of like peril that comes with assuming that like all Asians are good at math is that Asians end up internalizing the stereotype, and then if there is an Asian who like isn't good at math, they're sort of like pushed out of the Asian community. Like if you're not smart, it's like very difficult to like reassimilate yourself into the Asian community, because like everyone expects you to live up to that standard of like you're good at math, you're good at like computer science, you're good at like data analysis or whatever. And then if you're not, you're sort of like rejected from the community because that's all the community knows. Like the community is built upon thriving off of this perception because they can commoditize that perception, right? They can sell themselves as like good scientists, good mathematicians. But then if you're not fulfilling that stereotype, then you're pushed out, and then it's very difficult for you to like find your way back because you're Asian, but you also don't do what Asians are good at. So like, what purpose do you have to the overall like system? And that's why like having that lack of individualism, having this stereotype in the first place is like dangerous for people who don't fit the stereotype, because then they end up being in an even worse position than before.
And even on like the complete opposite side of the spectrum, I know so many Asian Americans, especially younger ones, who have made being good at school like a major part of their personality, which is frankly very annoying.
Oh yeah, you're definitely not thinking of a specific name right now.
But yeah, I think it's very harmful, regardless which side of the spectrum you're on.
I think like, so if we want to talk about like people making school their personality, I think it comes less so from like a decision. It's not like they're voluntarily deciding like, oh yeah, I think like school is so cool and I'm gonna dedicate myself to it. It's more like they've been forced by like external factors because they know they need more to succeed than like other races do. Like, I think it's fair to say that in some sense, the people who are super try hard in schools are like very annoying, and the people who are like all they care about is like getting the good grades and getting their homework done, like they're not really good for like they're not very good like socially. I think that's like somewhat fair to say, but also it's worth considering that like they're kind of being pushed into this situation not really of their own will, because like they need to not only live up to the model minority expectation, they need to exceed that expectation if they really want to be successful. Whereas like, say for instance, I'd say like primarily like white students, they don't have to live up to as high expectations or even like exceed those high expectations to be successful. Like you could be, I would say like empirically and from my own experiences, you can be a white student and not really be like too talented in any field and then still find success. But Asian students or like really any minority students have to live up to the model minority expectation and then go even beyond that if they want to get into like say a good college, a good job, have a good career. It's really I think like the idea that these people are like annoying is like kind of short-sighted, like respectfully, because you have to sort of consider that like they're not really doing it of their own free will. They're kind of like forced into it. I don't know if you guys want to.
I mean, there's that poem, "Roses are red, violets are blue. There's always an Asian better than you," and I think
we just got really racist on this podcast out of nowhere.
I mean, of course, it's not like 100% serious, but I think there's definitely some like I wouldn't say truth, but some like societal backing, and in which you always, as an Asian American, you always strive to be better than the ones next to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the poem is a good example of how there's pressure on Asians and generally the model minority standards is that they don't really come in forms where people go up to an Asian and tell them you have to be good at this, that, and whatnot, and they list out the traits that you're supposed to be good at. It comes in more subtle ways that are more difficult to recognize and build up over time. Such as a friend joking like, "Oh, you're Asian, but you're bad at math, huh? What's up with that?" Or that poem that Henry brought up. So it's important to recognize that these stereotypes and the pressure is not always placed so directly, but it can come in many indirect ways that sort of subconsciously make you put yourself in a stereotype more, I guess, or have it more solidified in your mind.
Yeah, I think this is a really good topic that Max brought up. This isn't so much related to Asian minority, the model minority, but more so to racism in general. Just because you don't witness an act of racism on the daily does not mean racism doesn't exist. I think it's really dangerous to live in that sheltered mindset because for the longest time I was oh, there's no way racism exists. I don't see I don't know, for instance the Ku Klux Klan running around still operating. And obviously these egregious acts of racism don't exist in today's society because they are so easily vilified. But that just means that more invisible forms of racism have a much easier time pervading our daily lives because it's so difficult to recognize. For instance, if your friend makes a joke, I should put it out there that I'm fine with Asian jokes for the most part. I make them myself, but generally they stem from a place of sort of prejudice because if your friend makes a joke, if your non-Asian friend, for instance, let's say you're bad at math. If your non-Asian friend, for instance, makes a joke oh, you're not good at math, you don't live up to the stereotype, ha ha ha. Yeah, they're not living up to the stereotype that is incredibly harmful and forces Asians into a specific mold that they can't really escape. So I don't I think in that sense, these jokes happen on a daily basis, and they happen really often that it's become normalized. But you kind of have to look at what the underlying meaning of that joke is. They don't fit a stereotype that is harmful to Asian Americans, and as such, they themselves are going to be in an even worse position. Meanwhile, the person making the joke probably doesn't have to deal with this ever because they're not Asian themselves, and they don't have to live up to the stereotype, or they don't have to feel the rejection that comes when they don't live up to that stereotype. So it's important to recognize these invisible forms of racism. I guess you could call I guess they're microaggressions because they can build up and be sort of dangerous, and they keep building up that perception.
All right, let's move on to how the model minority myth affects general minority groups.
Oh, yeah. So as I sort of discussed earlier, it's really hard to it's hard for Asians to go into sort of manager or overseer positions because they're perceived as not good leaders. And there's that myth, what is it? There's that, I forget exactly what it's called. For some people, there's the glass ceiling. For others, there's the bamboo ceiling. Which also, I just want to say, I feel that term is super harmful to general Asian racism discourse. Why do you call it a bamboo ceiling? Can you not just call it something else? Bamboo exists everywhere. America has bamboo, not necessarily just the Orient, but whatever. So if you want to talk about the bamboo ceiling, it's this concept that there's a sort of soft cap for how far Asian Americans can advance in the workplace because all higher positions are managed by either white people or just generation dominant groups that don't really have an interest in seeing Asian Americans advance. And I can say from personal experience, I know someone who works super hard and is super successful in their position, and yet their higher ups who are white don't give them the responsibilities and the freedoms they need to do their job in an easier fashion. And this is super common in pretty much all companies because companies aren't run in a very calculating way. Companies at the very, very top are all run by either a group of friends or a people who share in a belief. Basically, I guess you would call it a sort of brotherhood. And this brotherhood doesn't have an interest in seeing like Asian Americans advance up the corporate ladder, because like why would they? It doesn't really benefit them. They sort of just want to keep the status quo, and like seeing Asian Americans advance isn't really appealing to like any of their interests. And as such, you see a lot of like Asian Americans who are really good at what they do and are super hardworking. They don't receive promotions nearly as much as, like, for instance, other like white coworkers, or like I guess like mostly I would say like, I don't want to say like white, I want to say like European coworkers, because like that generally European and American, like generally, actually no, white's a better word for it. Generally, those people end up receiving a lot more benefits, and yeah, sort of lost my train of thought there. Sorry about white people.
White people. Yeah, I remember one of the things that my parents would always tell me is that if you have the skill to do a job that no one else can do, you'll always have a job. And I feel like this relates to this conversation somewhat, in that if you, like, no matter how prejudiced the higher ups are, no matter how much they don't want to hire you specifically, or you just because you are a certain race or background, if you have the skills and they need the skills, they'll always eventually hire you, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with that, but like for the purpose of this podcast, which is like I'm guessing to like educate people about what the model minority is, I think it's dangerous to like place yourself in a sense of like complacency, where you're like, oh, everything will be all right as long as you have these marketable skills. Because this worker that I know that I'm talking about, like, yes, his skills are very unique, and like pretty much he's the only person that is able to like set out his goals and like actually complete them and actually help the company. He's like the only one with his unique set of skills that is able to that he can fulfill. However, that doesn't mean that like his job is any less harder, because, for instance, right, everyone else who does like a job at the same level as him, they get assistance, they get more funding, they get more resources. He is basically left like all out on his own, because it's perceived like, oh, he's Asian, he's a hard worker, he's able to get things done by himself. And I think like if you want to say that like you have marketable skills, you'll be fine, I think that ignores like the more nuanced conditions of a workplace, where you're not given like any assistance in what you do, whereas other people are. And that's like really common because of this model minority stereotype, because people believe that like Asians can get through like any job without complaining, and if they complain, well, like then they can easily be dropped as well. Even like if they complain, then they're not worth keeping around, even if they have like a unique set of marketable skills. Mm-hmm. So yeah,
I think going back to the particular saying that Henry mentioned, the idea that, you know, if you just work hard enough on that skill, you know, you'll succeed and get promotions or whatever. I think the idea of, you know, if you just keep working hard, if you continue to work and do your best and be diligent and all that, I think that kind of shows a little bit of the, I guess, one of the traits of the model minority stereotype, you know, the whole hard-working thing and putting your head down and continuing regardless. So I think it can, you know, it does kind of fit with the stereotype in a sense, and we kind of talked about how, you know, that might not always be so great all the time.
Actually, no, that's a really good point. I don't want to roast like Henry's parents too much, because one of them is in fact in the room with us, but I will say that like Asian American parents do a very good job of perpetuating the model minority, because they tell their kids like, oh, just keep your head down, work hard, study hard, get through university, get a job, you'll be fine. Like, that is exactly what the model minority is. It's just telling you to like work hard, keep your head down. And by doing that, you are fulfilling the model minority. So like, it's interesting to look at like how ingrained the model minority is and how associated it is with success in America on the part of like Asians generations ago. Because like, that's exactly what they did, and they succeeded, and like they're doing fine for themselves now. But we can do better, because we recognize that like we aren't just confined to working hard and keeping our heads down. We can like break the current stereotype that we have and like we aren't limited to just like one thing as Asians. But I digress. That's not really related to this.
I think the saying really reflects the generational differences between our current generation and my parents' generation, of seeing how adhering to the model minority in the past gave success, and that was really the only way to survive as an immigrant, is just to assimilate, put your head down, do the work, and get paid. Now I think it's a very different climate where, yes, you can still adhere to the model minority and still somewhat succeed and do very well in life, but now there is that option of doing your own thing.
Yeah.
Breaking the mold.
I think like the model minority fulfilling the model minority works as a sort of short-term solution to like having a bad life, like for instance, I know like my family moved from China to America, and then they fit that model minority stereotype and they found success with it. But that's a very short-term solution because it ends up making future generations locked into whatever it is like you were doing before, right? So for instance, like it sort of risks like if your ancestors were like, I don't know, they were like doctors or they were like physicians or something, if the model minority worked for them, they're going to believe that like that's the only good way to get a life in America. So they're going to tell their kids, who are going to tell their kids, to keep working as physicians, keep working their head down. And they end up perpetuating this myth, and it ends up like sort of solidifying the Asian stereotype in stone. So I think it's kind of dangerous for like, I don't know how many people are going to view this, but like if you're a parent, like don't just keep telling your kids to like keep their head down and like work hard, because like, that's just going to further make it worse in the long run, because now we're just kind of like perma-viewed as this like diligent, hardworking, quiet, cheap race that can be exploited.
Yeah, so I think a danger of the stereotype of the model minority is also, even though we're becoming more aware of it now and we're trying to, break the mold, as Henry said, it's the easiest option to default to because it's a path for Asian Americans that's very clearly been written out. It's, there are a clear set of instructions to follow, steps to follow. It's much easier than if you didn't take the path and then you'd actually have to look at your, individual situation and make decisions based on that. It's a lot more difficult than just following the same trend over and over again. And, that's a big problem, right? Because it kind of looks like the easiest option because you have everything written out for you. And that's why I think even though we're becoming more progressive and more aware of how harmful this stereotype is, some people might still continue to follow it or take it just because it looks the easiest, despite all the downsides it'll have in the long run. How many negativities will appear in your life if you do end up taking it.
I think the going back to what Sean said, that if your parents or grandparents immigrated to America as physicians and succeeded as physicians, the sons and daughters and grandsons would eventually follow in the path or be guided towards that path. And I think that's very true, but not only towards those people, not only towards those who came to America as successful doctors or physicians. I think it's also including almost every Asian ethnicity that come to America. This actually want to transition to talking about the different ethnic groups and how not everyone in the Asian group is as successful as it may seem. As the Asian group in America is considered one of the most successful / earns the most money in the whole America. And frankly, if you look at the different ethnicities, this is just not true. While yes, as a group, it's very, very successful, but it's the main countries that have successful people completely overshadow the other smaller countries. Like for example, India and China are the two most earning countries that come from Asia, while other countries like Vietnam and Laos and etc. are have a very large portion of their American population in poverty, and I feel like this model minority definitely overshadows all the less successful groups of Asians in America.
Yeah, this sort of plays back into like that idea of like if you don't fit the model minority, you end up getting rejected from like the Asian community. What I think like what Henry's talking about is like slightly more like malignant, because in this case, it's not that you get rejected from, if you don't fit the model minority, you get rejected from the Asian community. It's just that your problems go like completely unnoticed, because right now, like we really only focus on the most successful Asians in the current discourse of Asian American racism. But we don't really talk about like smaller countries that have to experience it as much. Like for instance, Henry mentioned like Vietnam and like the Philippines, because like not only are these countries smaller, they're also significantly like less successful when compared to other groups in America. So it's the fact that like a danger of the model minority is that like countries that don't fit it or people that don't fit it just like get completely ignored. Like they're not part of the focus anymore, and their problems don't get treated either. So worth focusing on.
Yeah, so I want to kind of go back to what Henry said about how, I guess, different Asians were, I guess, like perceived successful or not. But you know, the measurement for that was through money, right? You know, you're poverty, you're rich, or you know, you're earning well. I think with the current state of model minority and how older generations have conveyed it to newer generations, at least from what a little bit from what I've experienced, is that success is wealth, right? To be successful, you need to be wealthy, you need to make money. More money is better. You want to try and get better jobs and whatnot, and then again, you take that whole university path to do all that studying and whatnot. And so that's also pretty harmful, because when you just view success as wealth, you're cutting out a lot of other things in life, right? Social, you know, having good mental health, all those important things are not really mentioned as much as just trying to be wealthy and successful when we're discussing these topics.
Well, I think when it comes to that point, like in America, wealth is kind of the like if we're playing by the system's rules, wealth is kind of the only way that you can achieve happiness, because of how like capitalistic our society is. It's like really difficult to get happiness if you don't have financial freedom. So on that point, I think that's like somewhat legit. If we're like going purely off of that point, I think it's somewhat legit. I'm not going to talk about like how much I hate America and like how much I think it's the underlying systems are like incredibly flawed. But if we're viewing it just by like here are the rules and here's how you play by them, like wealth is kind of the only way that you do achieve happiness in America. I'm not saying that's good or bad. Well, actually, I'm saying that's bad. But like unfortunately, like you get to be happy, you need financial freedom. Also, I think, sorry, I want to go back to a point that we mentioned before.
Would tell their offspring to guide them towards being doctors.
Just calls offspring. No, never mind. I completely forgot what point I had to make. That was kind of moot.
I think that also wraps around to why Asians are presumed to be or are guided towards being doctors, dentists, lawyers. It's because of how much money that they earn on a regular basis. And I think going back to how smaller countries come in poverty want their children to continue this path of success, of becoming a doctor, as that's a major life-changing, societal moving kind of path, even though their parents have never even been to college or don't know what the process is like. But there's still this expectation or hope that their children can achieve what they've always wanted their children to achieve, which is earn money.
I remember what point I had before. It was like, I like know this podcast isn't like really popular, but like for parents that do watch it, I think we should put it out there that we do recognize like how easy it is to go for the path that like Max laid out. That like, oh, you study hard, you go to school, get a job, be successful. But it's important to note that you shouldn't like try to encourage them to only take this path. By boxing your child in, it ends up making life super like, first off, they don't just need to be like, sure, doctor, physician, yes, it's definitely an easy way to make money, but there are other jobs in America, and like, you don't need to box them in this perception that like this is the only way to be successful. So yeah.
Right. So I think because the Asian communities, especially the older generations, they've recognized these as working jobs that are successful if you go for them. They really want their kids or newer generations usually to focus on them because I guess they're afraid of failure if they explore another career or other career options that haven't really been explored by Asians so much. It's unexplored territory, right? It's only now that we're starting to see more Asians in as prominent figures in stuff like music or acting and all that stuff. So I think a lot of what wanting your kids to become like doctor, physician, pharmacist, what some of that comes from is just a fear of failure that makes it harder to progress as a community overall, to be able to find careers in other places.
Just to put it out there too, like we recognize to the parent listeners, we do recognize that like if you fail as an Asian in America, it's significantly more difficult than like any other race. I'm not gonna say any other race. It's significantly more difficult than like white people failing, definitely. So we recognize that like you don't want to make your kid risk that, because if they do, whatever like consequences they've seen in movies, it's going to be like worse than that. So and like really there's like very little chance of like bouncing back. So we do recognize it. It's just like it's kind of worth the risk to like not be permanently stereotyped and like confined into like a racial category, I guess. So yeah.
I think a good thing that Max said was this is all of this sources from a fear of failure, and I feel like the fear of failure from parents or felt by parents are generally also felt by the kid, and I think it comes from their upbringing, and basically failing was unacceptable, but in reality everyone fails. And I think a good way to wrap this up is that for parents at least, is that your kids are going to fail. It's not the failures that define them though, it's how they pick themselves up and get through those failures. So I think one way to put this is just let your kid do their own thing, let them fail as many times as they need, let them find their way in life.
Sorry, that was like really emotional and like motivational, and I don't want to like ruin it too much, but I'm probably going to, respectfully.
Understandable.
The phrase like your kid's gonna fail a lot in life and like you need to let them fail. Like Asian parents have a really hard time like really taking that to heart, because in their life when they failed in America, it's been like catastrophic. Like when they fail, it makes their life like so much more difficult that they don't want to like ever go through that experience again, and they especially don't want their children to go through that experience, period. Mm-hmm. So like if you tell these like parents like, oh, it's okay for your kid to fail, like let them fail, they're not going to just like take that at face value. It's really like I think the general belief of like failing in America is like that's it, it's game over, it needs to like change. It's not really as high stakes anymore before, because like first off, racial perceptions, like while I hate to admit it, like have improved over time, like to some degree. And it's not so much like you fail as an Asian, you're now just like thrown out. If nowadays the world is a lot more forgiving, and I think like the worries that I'm speaking to the Asian parents here, the worries that you have had before aren't as founded as they were back then as they are today, because nowadays there are safety nets in place. If you're listening to this podcast, you yourself are probably like at least somewhat successful, so you are the safety net for your kids. Your kids didn't have a safety net before, now they have you. So I think it's important to identify here that like not just like you should let your kids fail, it's that they are allowed to in their current state because they have so many things to catch them. One, for you. Two, systems are not as harsh on Asian Americans as they were before. They're still pretty bad though, don't get me wrong. And three, like generally society doesn't view like Asian Americans in the light that they did like a couple decades ago. So yeah.
So I think a general message in that is that America has many things to protect from failure, I guess. As Sean said, there's a lot of safety nets.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, we do recognize that, like, America's, like, relatively speaking, the best country among all countries, but, like, if you, like, analyze America as it is, like, it's really, really crummy. Not, like, relatively speaking, but, like, objectively speaking, it is just a crummy country. So, like, it's important to recognize the need for social change as parents. You can't just say, like, things are fine as they are now, because they're not going to be. And they aren't. Because I'd say, like, maybe, like, 4 or 5 generations down the line, you can really see, like, if we continue on this path of, like, cementing the model minority into American culture, specifically that Asian Americans are a part of that model minority and they, like, make up that model minority, you can see, like, probably, like, 5 or 6 generations down the line, like, how much that makes life difficult for your children. Like, they are forced to study a certain topic that they may or may not enjoy. Like, they're offered pretty much, like, no freedoms in, like, what they want to do in life. Yeah, like, specifically, like, European races or, like, white races are, like, offered way more mobility. And, like, that's obviously not what we want. So, yeah.